Hi friends, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're continuing our exploration of the war in Israel, and we're asking what's next, specifically with the Dati Leumi community in Israel. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly essays. One of the things that I find extraordinarily gratifying about the community that we've built together is when someone reaches out and inevitably begins by reaching out and saying, I've never called a podcast before, I've never written to a podcast before. And I like seeing that because it reinforces what to me has always been the case, is that we are more than a podcast. We are a community of sorts where we're trying to navigate through the most difficult issues, perhaps sometimes the most unspoken issues, sometimes the most controversial issues, but we're trying to work through these issues together. And there's a communal component to what I believe 1840 is and 1840 represents, and particularly on an issue as contentious, as important, as central as our commitment to Israel, which when you dig down does have a lot of issues that we're still working out in real time together. Different divides between diaspora and Israel. I never even liked the word diaspora. I can't even say the word without thinking of the yeshiva band. I don't know if you're with me. It's the only place my mind goes when I say the word diaspora. But diaspora, meaning the Jewish communities outside of Israel and Israel itself, and the divides that take place within Israel. And obviously, when we're talking about different communities within Israel and different issues that relate to the unfolding war in Israel, some of these are going to arise. And the episodes that we've been doing asking what's next. We've asked what's next about the civic revolution. We've asked what's next about the Haredi community. We've asked what's next about anti-Semitism on campus. The episode that we did about what's next in the Haredi community sparked a great deal of responses, because it is an important issue and it's one that is hard to talk about without getting entrenched in kind of like old ideological debates, and to deal with kind of the questions that lay before us, before our very eyes. And I am extraordinarily proud and so grateful of the episode that we did together with Eli Pillay, but that doesn't mean that it didn't spark or kind of trigger or give rise to certain feelings that people may have, both within the Haredi community, outside the Haredi community, the American yeshivish community, the American Modern Orthodox community. We are playing a little bit of inside baseball on here. I know we're on the right track when I get a positive email from my uncle Alan, who is not an inside baseball player. He lives in Vermont. But when my Uncle Alan, he reached out to me recently and said, I've been listening to every one of these episodes, and he sent me a note of appreciation for my uncle. And it meant the world to me, because it's nice that my uncle listens to me, but that's not why it was so gratifying. It was so gratifying that there's a Jew in Vermont who is not, centrally located in the five towns or in Teaneck, is quite a bit away from a lot of the inside baseball discussions, and still is able to not only follow them, we try to make everything accessible here to the best of our ability, but finds them educational. And I got an email after we did the episode on the What's Next for the Haredi community with Eli Pillay, which was a very important conversation and discussion. And I can't think of a better representative for kind of approaching these questions than Eli Pillay, who does it with such thoughtfulness and generosity. But we did get an email. I don't want to get into the polemics about what he's saying. He's sharing his feelings about listening to one of our episodes while serving in Gaza. And that, even for me, gives me a moment to pause, and instead of responding or saying why the episode was good or wasn't good or any of these ways, I wanted to just hold that for a moment, that someone in Gaza who was fighting to defend the Jewish people took the time while in service to not only listen to one of our conversations, but to reach out. And that really alone, for me at least, Dayenu, this is the community that we're trying to build, to be able to have these conversations, to be able to hear them, to be able to hold them, even when they're uncomfortable, even when they raise questions that we may either deeply disagree with or we may find grating on our lifestyle and our way of life, because it grates on me as much as anybody else who lives in the United States, to hear what it really means, to experience what it really means to serve, because that finger is pointed at me as well. And it's a hard finger to stare at, but it's an important finger, and it's one that we shouldn't ignore, and we shouldn't try to talk about all the other important ways that diaspora Jewry, the American Jewish community, does serve and does help Amcha Yisrael. Because in this way, let's be honest, we don't. And instead of an instinctive response, instead of devolving into ideological polemics, I want to hold that. And I wanted to begin the episode. We invited him on to talk to him because it was such a moving email and it was something that I wanted to hear more about. It was somebody that I wanted to talk to, and it was somebody who I thought if he took the time out while defending the Jewish people in Israel, we should take the time out to hear a little bit more about him and what he has to say. And it is with that, it is an absolute privilege to speak to someone who he spoke to me while he was in service. He had a few moments. We spoke about the room he was in, some side room on a Zoom, and really out of not only Hakaras Hatov for what he represents and what he's doing, but out of Hakaras Hatov for the time that he took out to share his thoughts and experience with us. It is really the greatest privilege to invite on in our conversation with Gideon Davis. One person who we heard from is somebody named Gideon Davis, who is not only in Israel, but is actually currently serving. And I'm speaking to him right now. I am looking at him and I see him wearing what appears to be an army winter coat above his army uniform. It is our absolute privilege to have Gideon Davis, who is fighting and defending the Jewish people, I believe, in Gaza now. I don't know what we're allowed to share, what we're not allowed to share. But Gideon Davis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
It really is a privilege. And maybe you could tell us just quickly, where are you right now? You're in a white room. I don't know what you're allowed to share. I know what the rules are.
No, so currently I'm in a base called Ir Habadim. It's about 20 minutes south of Beersheba.
Okay.
Somewhat near Gaza, but I'm not in any sort of combat situation currently. We're in a break. So I'm part of what's called Khatibat Sanchanim. That's the paratroopers regiment. So we went in from the first entrance, we went in a week later. And we stayed in for just under 7 weeks. Came out for a bit of a break to breathe for a second, see our friends and family. And now we're preparing to go back in.
Wow. There are very few words that I could say to really express our gratitude, our appreciation for those who risk their lives on behalf of the Jewish people. And it's really that subject which I think gives you a great deal of credibility. I don't know how many 1840 episodes you have listened to, and this is not a time to grill you on your 1840 listening, but you did listen to our episode where we spoke about what is next for the Haredi community, and you did take the time to write an extraordinarily thoughtful email. Tell me why you felt necessary to reach out. What do you think we missed in that episode?
The first thing I can confirm, I am definitely an 1840 fanboy. Listened to a tremendous amount of the podcast.
That's very kind of you.
In terms of what I felt the episode missed, the episode very much focused on the needs of Medinat Israel. We have Medinat Israel, and that requires Jews to serve in an army. It feels like, okay, so we have a need. I guess we'll fulfill that need. We'll fill in a gap that we have. And I think it sort of doesn't necessarily focus on the other side. Why do we, as the Jewish people, both on a klal level and a prat level, both
collectively and individually?
Yeah. What's our need for the Medina? And by fulfilling those needs, we also get something back. That was the thing that I felt missed. And I'll be honest, I went into the army not necessarily appreciating this. I went into the army saying, okay, I'm fulfilling a need that the Medina requires something from me. It requires Jews to serve. So I'm a Jew and I'll come and serve. What I found out after I had a year and 2 months of initial training, and at the end of those, a commander of mine who was not religious, he said to us, I'll clean up the language a little bit.
Thank you.
Now that you've been abused by the land of Israel, you have permission to love the land. Which he probably didn't realize. He was quoting the Gemara, Eretz Yisrael Niknes Yisurim.
Yes, the Gemara in Brachos that says
right.
The land of Israel is acquired through pain, through difficulty, through sacrifice.
Right. So 1 year and 2 months of training as hard as you can, of passing out and of weeks of walking in the north, all the hills and the 50% body weight and all that, whatever. You come out of that with a love for Eretz Yisrael and also Am Yisrael that it's incomparable. And to be able to honestly wake up in the morning, say the sentence, okay, we have this cause and people are going to die for this cause. That's a machir. That's a price. It's a fact. It's already happened and it's going to happen in the future. Am I okay to pay that price? And so every single morning after I wake up in Gaza, you say, yes, yeah, I am. And Baruch Hashem, I have my friends to the left of me, my friends to the right of me, who I trust absolutely. If it comes to that, I can say absolutely certainly. That's fine. Mothers and fathers, that just like Abraham Avinu, who was willing to put his son on the Mizbeach, on the altar, they say, that's fine. Okay, we understand there's something bigger than us. And that sentence of there's something bigger than us, and we're willing to give everything we can up for it, that's something that creates an ahava, a love. I often quote the Pasuk in Shir Shim, Ki cholat ahava ani, because I'm lovesick. That's how I feel. There's my logical side, and there's just, I'm in love.
You studied in yeshiva. I could see you now. You're wearing a yarmulke. You're observant. Tell me a little bit about the dynamic specifically that you feel and that you maybe hear from friends who are also serving vis-a-vis the Haredi community. This is a very sore and difficult point of contention. At 1840, we're never looking to make things more divisive, but we also don't shy away from very real conversations. And I think one of the things I admired about Eli Pillay is that he also was not saying, let's not have the conversation, let's not talk about this. And he was talking as an insider within the Haredi world. But what have you felt, and what do you think when, over the last couple months, there has been a great upswell of unity? I'm sure there have been people from the Haredi community or the Hasidic community even who have come to visit bases, which is a very beautiful sign. Do you sometimes have latent reservations that maybe you're not going to get up and start yelling at somebody at this point, but what are the latent feelings that either you have, and you'll tell me if it's you or friends that you've overheard, towards some of the dissonance or some of the difficulty of really wrapping your head around what's the future of this society when such a large segment of Israeli society does not serve and does not risk and sacrifice everything for the physical defense of the Jewish people?
So of course I'm found in what's called the Dati Leumi community, because if you're trying to put me in a box, I guess that's the box.
Sure.
You can fit me in. Of course, saying Dati Leumi it's a little bit crazy, because then you're shoving a Talmud of Yeshivat Har Etzion in the same box as a Talmud of Merkaz Harav. They're not the same.
Correct.
But, okay, let's allow us to use the box for a second, which means that we're stuck in between two sides. We've got the secular Zionists who establish the state, who have the idea that we need a nation state and it needs to be in our land. On the other side of us, we have the Haredim who say we value Talmud Torah learning, we value Shmirat Halakha, keeping Halakha. And what the Dati Leumi community came along, we said, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim.
We could find a way to connect to both of these values and express both of these values. Yes.
Not only do we believe in both of them, but the only reason we agree with the secular Zionists is because of the Haredim. As in, the only reason we believed in the nation state in the first place was because we opened our Tanakh and read what was there. It seems like the nation state's a pretty important part of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. So we're found in that tension between us.
People have visited your bases. I'm sure that's happened. I'm sure people have come. They do throw the barbecues. Have you ever had such a conversation, or do you have these feelings when they are there?
So I mean, the bases that we've been on are sort of the bases that have been less fashionable to visit. It's often the reservists to get this kind of... So I haven't had those dreams so much.
Can you just dig down on that a little bit? Because I don't know about these distinctions. Where is it more fashionable to throw lavish flashing barbecue parties, and where is it less exciting? It's these type of quirks and details.
Ooh, you might be touching on a soft spot here. There is a feeling that the reservists get more of a special treatment.
Oh, there's a little bit of that. Okay, that's important to know.
Underground feeling, at least in terms of, and also, which happens to be the bases that one of it just trends inaccessible. We're often in the field and not leaving the base so much, but. Also, I was in Gaza for just a tremendous amount of time.
So they're not throwing barbecues there, obviously.
Right. So they're not coming into Sajaiya and Rimal and whatever else.
But let me ask you about your relationship, not just to Haredim, but to almost the American community. I don't want to divide up American Modern Orthodox versus American Yeshivish. People oftentimes think that the Dati Leumi community is comparable to the American Modern Orthodox community. And I think they are sorely mistaken. Now, you are not American. You're originally from England. I am curious from your vantage points. I'm sure, a great deal of Americans and modern Orthodox Americans who did not choose to continue their lives in Israel, and they went back to their communities in America, the Five Towns, Teaneck, Boca, LA. How would you express the difference between somebody who you just said you put yourself in the box of the Dati Leumi community, which I've always said it's not great branding for Americans, but I oftentimes think that there are differences that we don't often pay attention to between the Dati Leumi community in Israel and the American Modern Orthodox community. Do you agree with that? And what would you say the difference is? 100%.
That's why something called Chardal exists. Chardal means mustard in Hebrew, but it also means Haredi and then Dati Leumi, which means that there are people who are, it's actually one of the things I made before when I mentioned Yeshivat Har Etzion and also Yeshivat Merkaz Harav. In terms of there are people who consider themselves Dati Leumi, but don't want to go to university and don't want to interact too much with the modern world, that is the distinction.
So Chardal is probably closer to American Modern Orthodox. Is that what you're saying, just so I understand correctly?
No, sorry. Chardal is the opposite. It's almost closer to Yeshivish.
Okay.
They're also Tzionim. They're also Zionists, and they really very much strongly believe in the nation state. Most of them will use the phrase Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, that it's the first flowering of redemption, as in the state of Israel.
Sure. And just so our listeners understand, again, Chardal, which as you correctly pointed out means mustard in Hebrew, is an amalgamation of Ches, Resh, Char, meaning Charedi, and Dal, meaning the acronym Dati Leumi. Let's focus in on the kind of straight Dati Leumi community. What do you think the differences are that you've noticed between the Dati Leumi community and the American Modern Orthodox community?
It's more of a bewilderment of why we put them in the same box in the first place, because they're dealing with completely different issues. I think the only similarity they have really is that they said, okay, we're currently dealing with one thing in Judaism. I think there's something we can add, or not add, but something that we failed to notice inside of that. So I don't know who you would consider the father of modern orthodoxy, Rav Hirsch or Soloveitchik, I'm not sure. They looked at the Judaism in the world and they said, I think we're missing something. Rav Hirsch came along and said, German culture has something to offer us. You can be a good German and be a good Jew. In fact, you might even go further, say, what it means to be a good Jew is to also be a good German and be cultured. Rav Soloveitchik came along and he said, wait, one second, we're missing something. We need to study the sciences. This is going to increase our yiras shamayim, our fear of heaven, an incredible amount. That's a very different message, as in studying secular subjects and general involvement with the world is a very different topic to, I believe that there should be a nation state now in Eretz Yisrael. Why the two things put together? I think Rav Lichtenstein says it's just both of them sort of, I'm nervous to say they added something onto Judaism. They didn't add it, they just found it in the Torah.
Sure. And in the Dati Leumi world, it's a much more radical departure from the culture that we're familiar with in America, which is why I think a lot of Americans almost subconsciously feel more of a kinship to the Haredi community, having nothing to do with ideology. I think, and I'm talking literally about myself here growing up, it's like, it's hard to feel connected to a community that wears sandals and untucked shirts, but that's a real thing. The culture doesn't resonate with some of the formality or almost the socioeconomic status of America, where the Dati Leumi community is really participating in a very new chapter in Jewish history. And there's a lot more fluidity and there's a lot more excitement. For you, did you depart from your upbringing? The fact that you decided to join the army, was this a departure from the trajectory that you had originally planned? And what would you attribute your ability and capacity to commit yourself in the way that you have for literally Leumi, for the national collective of Knesset Yisrael, of the Jewish people? What would you attribute your ability to make this commitment, especially, again, you'll tell us a little bit more, if it was a departure from your upbringing in any way?
The high school that I went to was, I think, the American equivalent you would probably call SAR, maybe.
Okay.
It wasn't necessarily the most religious high school. So until I'd come to yeshiva, I'd learned maybe 10 daf of Gemara. That's, kind of the Torah background I was coming from. That's number one. Number two, it's funny, with David, you often speak about your religious evolution.
Sure.
About what you wear.
Yes.
So the truth is, whilst I was, about a year into the army or so, I actually took off my blue shirts and started wearing t-shirts and jeans and hanging out my tits and blundstones. And so that was, for me, that was big.
And that's a real cultural change. That says something.
The first time I walked out of my flat with my t-shirt on, it was a bit like, okay, it's okay. Is someone watching? And every time I go back to England, I'm like, hey, do I take my shirts out the cupboard? Do I have my t-shirts? I'm representing that. Fine. That's the less important point. So first, I did grow up in the B'nai Akiva movement. So I already had an idea of Zionism in my head. That being said, I came to yeshiva, the place at university, to study mathematics in university in England. So it definitely wasn't the plan. I came to Eretz Yisrael. I came to what's called a Hesder yeshiva, which is a yeshiva where they combine army service and the yeshiva learning. The army service is shortened, so I ended up leaving that path. I wanted to do a longer army service in a slightly different unit. But I think I came and I saw the Judaism that the yeshiva I was learning in offered, and it felt so much richer.
Tell me why.
It spoke to what it meant to be a Jew in the world. Because when you're a Jew in Chutz La'aretz, I think your Judaism ends up sort of being in this box of, I keep halakha and I learn Torah. Of course, there's the broader spirituality and things you can bring into your day. However, as soon as you come to Medinat Yisrael, to Eretz Yisrael, suddenly that Judaism takes over your whole life. Suddenly, even when you're going to work inside an economy that's funding the Jewish state, which is Religious Zionism. It's the first flowerings of the redemption. Rav Kook has a pisgah about working out, basically, about going to the gym.
Sure.
I think it's a very controversial piece at the time it was released.
Very much so, sure.
It probably still is. One of my friends in the army actually showed it to me. He said, Gideon, have you ever seen this piece of Rav Kook? I said, no, I haven't. He showed it to me, and I got a shock when I saw it. Like, how can working out in the gym be Avodat HaKodesh, holy work? Okay, but it is, because that's the reality of what it means to be in Eretz Yisrael. It means that every single thing that you do becomes Avodat HaKodesh.
Is building that national consciousness and the national body of the Jewish people.
Even the land itself having that Kedusha.
God willing, when we come out of this, and it should be soon, and it should be with peace and serenity for the Jewish people. What do you think, emerging from this, the Dati Leumi community needs to do differently, if anything, to strengthen its ranks, to draw upon more people who have been awakened to the importance of the state of Israel? I think and I hope that people will be consciously or subconsciously transforming or revisiting how they relate to the state of Israel. I have been transformed in my relationship to the state of Israel over the last few months. And I'm curious for you, looking inside in the Dati Leumi community, what do you think are the ways in which the community needs to change? Either something they need to do more of, something they need to do less of. What do you hope to see differently, communally, when we emerge from this?
I'm not sure I'm so qualified to give the medication for the problems. I'm ultimately some 23-year-old with a year and a half of serious learning under his belt. What I can say is I actually asked this to Rav Meir Kahana, not the old Rav Meir Kahana.
Thank you for clarifying for our listeners.
Rather, he's a Dayan down south in Israel. He's currently running to be the next chief rabbi, a Dati Leumi candidate. And I said to him, we have a problem here. The Jews in Israel are not speaking the same language as the Jews in Chutz La'aretz. They don't understand that why you're speaking Sartar Rav Kook and not Rav Soloveitchik. His answer was that we need to start working out a way, how can we translate the Ruach of Yahadut Israeli? We need to work out a way of communicating with the Chutz La'aretz community what it means to be a Jew in Eretz Israel in an accessible way, in a way that Jews in Chutz La'aretz understand, without having to draft and experience it themselves. That's something I was told. I don't know about in terms of how well we're communicating the Chutz La'aretz, but I really, really do believe that the Dati Leumi community is on a good path. The amount of officers you would have seen with the kippah on their heads 20, 30 years ago is almost zero compared to nowadays. Not only are religious people overrepresented amongst officers, from my personal experience, the religious people who are officers tend to also be the more chazak religious guys, the stronger religious guys. It's the guys that you see in the base medrash on Shabbos learning. It's the guys you see being makpid on halacha, being strict on halacha. So there's definitely a strength there. And we also need to strengthen the mechina system.
Tell our listeners what a mechina system is.
So after high school, if you're a religious male in Israel, you have kind of two options. If you want to do something before you draft, either you can go and learn in yeshiva, and that's a morning seder, afternoon seder, night seder, as people will recognize. And there's also something called a mechina. It's a system I wasn't in one. I don't necessarily know it so well, but I have seen the results of what they create. Two of the biggest ones I've seen are Mechinat Eli, Mechinat Atzmona. What they are is, the idea is that not everyone's made to sit and learn all day. So we need to find a way to strengthen the religious personality so that he can go into the army and be that strong religious personality and shine that light in the army and create a religious culture and be not only just good in his halakha and his Talmud Torah, but also just be a good soldier who can carry on in the army and go up the ranks.
That is incredibly inspiring. Gideon, I can't thank you enough for reaching out. I'm so happy we were able to sneak this in. It's continued success, continued tefillos, and I hope that we get a chance to have a meeting in person with a barbecue, whatever's necessary. But thank you so much. Have a great Shabbos, and we'll be b'kesher. There is something vaguely nostalgic about these conversations. It reminds me in a way of almost the movie The Matrix, where in The Matrix he sees this cat walk by twice, like deja vu, and he says that means the Matrix is glitching when you realize that I've seen this before, I've done this before. And in a way, I'll be honest, the conversations today in this episode, both with Gideon and the Taragins that we're about to have, I feel a little bit of a glitch in the Matrix. Like, haven't I had this conversation before? And I know I have, because I spent 2 years in Israel. I learned in Yeshivat Shalavim, which is a yeshivat Hesder. And I'll be very honest with you, like on a personal level, I've had these conversations about the Dati Leumi community. Let me just first define that. I'm sorry I didn't do it earlier. Dati Leumi is the religious Zionist community in Israel. And for some reason, anytime I ever had a conversation about considering kind of what this community means and what it represents, like, I don't want to say like my mind shut down, but in a way it did. Like, it was never a serious contention for me. My excuse for never taking Israel seriously was because the communities that I always thought about and always speak about first and foremost was the Haredi community and the secular community. And I never really gave serious thought to being a part of or my connection to the religious Zionist community. And I was wondering, like, for myself, and it could be I'm fully alone in this, so I apologize if I am, but I was thinking to myself, what is it that growing up in the American Orthodox community that I was growing up, kind of a centrist American Orthodox community, had my toe, swam a couple laps in the yeshiva world, I swam a couple laps in the more modern Orthodox world, but I'm fully entrenched in American Modern Orthodoxy. Yet for me, I never gave serious consideration to the Dati Leumi community. And I deliberately call it Dati Leumi community because A, that's how they almost self-identify in Israel. They don't call themselves religious Zionists. It's more of an American term. term. I'm just thinking about what it was, and I think a lot of it boils down to almost like, where could you see yourself? Who do you see yourself in as like a mirror? Even if it's an imperfect mirror, you don't see yourself fully there, but where do you see yourself? And for me, like, I live among secular Jews, and I kind of have a template for what it means to be a secular Zionist in a way. Like, I kind of assume that I understand what that world is and what it represents. And on the flip side, I know a lot of Israeli Haredim. They are my family. My sister is Israeli Haredi. And it's more than that, because almost the way that they dress has so many parallels to the American mode of dress. And as you'll hear in the conversation, I almost need to apologize. A lot of this conversation has to do with sociological differences, because I'm trying to get to the root of the question of why modern orthodoxy, in my opinion, I could be fully wrong on this, has a hard time really seeing themselves and understanding what the Dati Leumi community is. And I think a part of it is that we almost superimpose modern orthodoxy on the Dati Leumi community. We assume we understand what the Haredi community is because we parallel them to the American yeshivish community. You know, with differences, they work, they don't work. There's more kollel in Eretz Yisrael, they work in America. Okay, they look the same. They're at our weddings. We know what a Haredi Jew comes to a wedding in the Marina Del Rey. They'll fit in. They'll fit right in. Won't be that difficult to understand their place. And the same is true with a secular Zionist. We understand where they fit in. We have secular work colleagues who are maybe not as well educated Jewishly. They never went to yeshiva. They never got a proper Jewish education. But we understand where they are in our world. They may be our relatives, our cousins, our colleagues, our coworkers. They may be us. And then it makes sense. But all of a sudden, I believe it breaks down almost completely when we confidently superimposed a sociological lens of modern orthodoxy onto the Dati Leumi community. We're like, oh, they're kind of like Israeli modern Orthodox. And I think that fully sells short what this community is and what it represents. I think there is more of a gap between American modern Orthodoxy and the Israeli Dati Leumi community than there is between secular Zionism and a secular Jew in America, or the Haredi community in Israel and the American yeshivish community in America. You're happy to disagree with me, but I think the gap is so much wider, almost because we rest on our, they're probably the same, more or less. I think the person who would be most uncomfortable at an American wedding at the Marina Del Rey, I don't know why I'm pointing out the Marina Del Rey, I didn't get married there, I got married at the Rockley, I think, is because it's just like a typical of, I have nothing against the Marina Del Rey, that's what I'm trying to say. I have nothing against American weddings, but I almost wanted to ask myself, which community would be most uncomfortable at our weddings? And I think the answer is a Dati Leumi person. In both ways, they don't dress like us, they don't wear suits and a tie and get very formal, maybe at their own wedding. We'll hear a great story about that. Maybe, but they dress differently, they look differently. Their approach, their cultural approach is so much different than us. And I think a lot of that has to do with two major factors, at least. Number one, I think their religious metrics are totally different than what we have in America. I think the American modern Orthodox community, ultimately all lines lead back to Yeshiva University, which I think has like very strong boundaries of how to preserve Yiddishkeit in America, which is a very strong, very noble centering of halacha as the primary vehicle to mediate your Yiddishkeit. And that is the way that Yiddishkeit has survived in America. Yet I believe in the Dati Leumi community, not that, God forbid, halacha is not centered. They have incredible poskim. We had Rev Rimon on 1840 to really talk about that. But the way they almost self-evaluate their own religious growth and journey is not kind of lockstep with your meticulousness in halachic observance. There are so many other metrics with which they evaluate, which they reflect upon. There are so many other ways, which is why there's even a phenomenon that when somebody considers making aliyah, you'll hear this without a doubt. One of the things that come up is an American rabbi will say, is this going to be good for you spiritually? Are you going to decline spiritually? Are you going to decline religiously in Israel? I have heard that myself. Not that I've ever asked the question. I've never even gotten that close. But the fact that somebody would respond that way, I think highlights very real differences in the way that we evaluate ourselves religiously. I think there is more risk, religious risk, in Israel than there is in America, because the religious community that they're building in Israel is still unfolding. There is almost still a mystery in a way of how your children are going to turn out, what the next generation is going to look like, as opposed to America, where I feel like we had that maybe in the 1940s and 50s, in that first generation after the Holocaust. How do we build up an American Judaism that's going to be strong, that's going to be deeply rooted, that's going to have the institutions and systems that are going to allow us to thrive in America? And we kind of found a formula that really works. And since then, in my opinion, everything that we've been doing has been trying to just reinforce that preservation, to reinforce that experience, where sometimes America can feel like a little bit of like a hamster wheel, like a Groundhog's Day, like we're repeating generation after generation in very amazing ways. And I'm not diminishing American Jewry. I am a part of it. But I'm trying to understand why I, David Beshefkin, had such a hard time really understanding what the Dati Leumi community is all about. And I believe that the Dati Leumi community is built upon this notion of like, we're not even sure what the next generation, we are still building. We are still trying to build and find out what is going to allow the Jewish character of the state of Israel to thrive. And they do this wearing two knapsacks that weigh them down. On the one hand, there's the knapsack of the secular Israeli community, which is like, how do we relate to them? What are we going to do with them? We want to be able to uplift and preserve the Jewish character of Israel. And on the other hand, are the enduring ideological battles that they have with the Haredi community in Israel, which are very real, and I'm not diminishing at all. Most Jewish leaders 100 years ago were not Zionists, and much of the discourse is almost built upon that centuries-old discourse around, should we have a state, should we not have a state, should we have Zionism, should we not have Zionism? And we're still kind of like marred in that old debate, while the secular Zionist community, wearing that knapsack, was willing to forge ahead and continue building. They did this building of the state of Israel that we have now, wearing both the knapsack of the question of relating and uplifting the secular Zionist community and the knapsack of all of the questions and doubts that are sowed by the Israeli Haredi community of, is this the right thing to do? Should we be doing it? Is it lechatchila? Our kids are not serving. And they still wearing two knapsacks, like on those difficult hikes that you probably have to go through on training, which I know nothing about because I never went into the IDF. But they know what it's like to really go on a journey, both physically and metaphorically, wearing heavy knapsacks that weigh you down and having the willpower and commitment to still forge ahead. And I think because of that commitment, their religious metrics are almost much more diverse than the metrics that we have in America for how we self-evaluate our religiosity in some very holy ways, and also in some ways that make the American Orthodox community, I'll be blunt, I think it makes us nervous. I think we wonder, well, if you go to Israel, you're going to stop dressing the same way, you're going to stop looking the same way. And finally, I think the last thing is that watching a community that has worn two knapsacks, weighing them down, yet having the willpower to forge ahead, has made the Dati Leumi community in Israel seem completely unfathomable. Almost something that we can't imagine in our wildest dreams, in our own lives, in our own families. You know, I'm somebody who travels a lot. I'm traveling this Shabbos. I'm going to Florida to speak as a scholar in residence. I'm nervous when I leave for Shabbos, already starting Monday morning. I'm nervous today. That's when I'm recording this. I'm nervous today. I live in Teaneck. My next door neighbor, Mickey and Ortal, I invited them. Maybe we'll have them on to speak directly, but they made a bar mitzvah. They were in Israel for Sukkot. They're Israeli. They're here as shluchim, and they made a bar mitzvah. That's why they were there in Sukkot. And when the war broke out on Simchas Torah, the family came back. Mickey stayed in Israel. He was in Israel for about 3 months. I think he came home maybe as a week or two ago. He finally came back. His family was here, our next door neighbor. And I'm watching my family, who, you know, we're like a typical American Orthodox family, getting by week by week. Thank God we have a lot of bracha, a lot of blessings, but our capacity is so diminished by the level of comfort that we've expected and how heavy of an emotional toll even slight disruptions play in our lives. And I look literally next door. I don't mean like same community. I mean walk out of my house, make a right turn, and walk 75 feet, even less, 50 feet, and you're at their house. And I'm watching a family. They went to Israel for a bar mitzvah, and their husband said, I am staying with the Jewish people to defend them. And the rest of the family came home. And I am watching next door a mother with children who also has a job, who also has to keep things together. And I just stand in awe. And I stand, it's unfathomable. To have the ability to carry two knapsacks and to still forge ahead is something that I find simply amazing. And amazing isn't even the right word. It's awe-inspiring, and frankly, the right word is, it is unfathomable to me. And that is an indictment on me. It is an indictment on our community. I simply cannot imagine it. It is much easier for me, and I have a place in the world when I think about the secular Israeli community. I have a place of where I can contribute. I can make them tzitzis. I could sponsor their tefillin. I have a place where my life and my money and whatever I'm able to do to support them actually plays a role. And I have a role to play in the Haredi community in Israel. I can support the yeshivas, I can support Kol Olim. And I think there's something about the religious Zionist community, the Dati Leumi community, that makes it almost harder to see yourself there, because I don't really have a role to play. Sure, they'll take any of our money. That's important. We should support them financially. But they have tefillin, and they have tzitzis, and they keep halacha, and they know how to learn, and they're learning daf yomi. And with all that, and with all the questions that ideologically have been hurled at them over the last 100 years from both sides of the community, wearing two knapsacks, they have stood at the border guarding the Jewish people with a full commitment to what Yiddishkeit can be in a land of our own. And it's hard to speak about this without coming off a little bit negative about the American Orthodox community, and I'll apologize in advance. I am guilty of it as much as anyone, and if there's any finger pointed, it is directly at David Beshefkin. Nobody should think I'm not pointing my finger at anybody else. I take it quite seriously, and I find it nearly unfathomable to even express my appreciation for what this community represents. But if there's one thing that October 7th has done for me in my little world here in Teaneck, on my little platform here in 1840, it is reimagining what that relationship should be, and that is paying less attention to the fact that they don't wear the same fancy shoes that I do, and paying less attention to the fact they don't wear suits to their weddings, and paying more attention to the level of commitment and what they have done in representing of what the future of Yiddishkeit can actually mean in Eretz Yisrael, and having the courage and capacity to really confront that question head on, which is why I wanted to dedicate at least an episode to really digging down on this question. And I know this is a long intro to a second interview in an episode, so I hope you bear with me, because I think it's that important, particularly to all of our American listeners, and I hope our listeners around the world, even our listeners in Israel. It's important for all of us to recognize and to give language, at least attempt to give language, to what their sacrifice and level of commitment represents and should represent in our lives. And that's why I am so grateful that Rabbi and Rabbanit Taragin, Rev Reuven and Shani Taragin, were willing to come on. The reason why I thought they would be an excellent voice in this area is, number one, they're bilingual. Not that they speak English and Hebrew, but they understand the American context, they understand the Israeli context quite deeply and quite seriously. I grew up in the same neighborhood as Rabbanit Shani Taragin, as you will undoubtedly hear. We grew up a few blocks away in Lawrence. I'm still very close to her brothers. I know her parents, and it is really an absolute privilege and pleasure to ask what's next for the Dati Leumi community. Here's our conversation with Rabbi and Rabbanit Taragin. The question that we are trying to explore and understand, and in some ways I think this is the hardest of our what's next question, is what is next for the Dati Leumi community in Israel. And the reason why this is such a hard question is because what is the Dati Leumi community? It is rife with misunderstanding. Most people superimpose our own modern orthodoxy, American or diaspora sensibilities onto the framework of the Dati Leumi community. And sometimes they're correct. There's certainly a lot of overlap. There are concentric circles that overlap, but they're not one and the same. And I was wondering if we could begin to hear of what you feel the differences are between American Modern Orthodoxy and the Dati Leumi community in Israel.
Okay, so this is a question that we actually do address with many of our students who are coming from more the Modern Orthodox yeshivot, day schools, and here they're exposed to teachers who are going to not only teach and support the values and fundamentals of modern orthodoxy, but religious Zionism. So as I'm sure you know historically as well, religious Zionism was more of a response, a political, nationalistic response in the 18th or really more 19th, 20th centuries to national Zionist political movements, and focus or basically incorporated many of the religious values and ideals. So in speaking about religious Zionism, the focus is more on the religious aspects of living in the land, settling the land, the mitzvot of the land, together with and the national identity of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel in the land of Israel, as opposed to modern Orthodoxy, focuses more on the integration of Jews within the broader society, within modern society. So, of course, you're going to have some overlap in terms of ideals and values, but the focus for religious Zionism is going to be more the ideas of the observance of halacha within the state of Israel, sometimes carrying with it messianic connotations as well, whereas modern orthodoxy doesn't necessarily have to include the same Zionist values in as much as the integration with the world around, also maintaining halachic observance.
It's interesting. Your answer, I think, bridges them much closer together. And I was wondering if you could almost share for a moment, and maybe I'm totally wrong. There are many different modern Orthodox communities and there are many different Dati Leumi communities. But my sense is the cultural difference is not quite as close together as you are saying. And maybe you could speak a little bit about what are some of the cultural barriers that people notice when they transition from an American modern orthodoxy. Let's talk the Yeshiva University community. They grew up in the Five Towns, they grew up in Bergenfield, they grew up in Boca, in LA, in Chicago, and they look at the center YU community. It encompasses many as their North Star. And then they decide to make Aliyah. And they're like, okay, so let's find the community that is the most similar. And for many people, what comes to mind is, let's say, a Beit Shemesh, and there's a lot of truth to that. But oftentimes, when they try to integrate into the Dati Leumi community, there are cultural misconceptions or barriers or things that they didn't expect. So without almost getting into the ideology, can you share with me some of the cultural differences in the transition between American modern orthodoxy and Israeli Dati Leumi?
So I personally think one of the major nafkaminot, one of the major ramifications is with regard to the general scope. If you were speaking about selecting a community, so you truly see that in the scope. For example, in the framework of modern orthodoxy, you'll have the more modern, the less modern, the right, the left, the center.
Sure.
Which is really, as you said, sometimes the yeshivish connotations. How integrated are you in society? How much are you maintaining a strict traditional halachic lifestyle? Whereas here, the scope of religious Zionism is very different. You have Haredi Dati Leumi, you have, Dati Leumi light, as some people call it, that it's not necessarily going to project the same way. And you also have it manifest through how Zionistic, meaning how much are you going to place those priorities on the land itself, on joining the army, for example, which I'm sure we're going to discuss today.
For sure.
I think the primary differences are going to be here, really both manifest through education, choice of how much are you going to be integrated within the broader, not necessarily modern society, and as much as you can be very Zionistic here and consider yourself Dati Leumi without necessarily always maintaining that same level of halacha. And at the same time, you can have a strong, staunch observance of halacha and not necessarily always go to the army at age 18. Maybe you'll be 25 and maybe you're going to place the emphasis on your learning coming from, let's say, YU, the Five Towns, and it's more difficult to find your place within the Eretz Yisrael Zionistic future, settlement, defense, security. So those are going to be many of the questions that come up.
That they negotiate with. If you'll allow me to surface one cultural difference, because I think, I'm talking from my own personal experience, one of the issues, it sounds so small to speak about now, and I assure you we're going to get to much larger issues as we speak more, but one of the small cultural differences, I wonder if I can almost hear this from Rabbi Taragin, is the way what a yeshiva student is expected to dress like. And I think that there are very real differences over here, where almost for myself, I'll be honest with you, like, maybe I'm a little bit more formal, even in the American. I'm on the less formal side in America, but I'm way more formal than your average student in Israel. I can't walk around with my button-down shirt untucked, and I'm wearing a button-down shirt. I'm rarely ever walking around in a t-shirt if I'm not in a gym, and I've never worn flip-flops outside of a pool area. And I'm wondering for you, how do you translate this when this comes up with your students? They want to make Aliyah, they're all in, they're ready to do it, and they start to dress in the Israeli mode, and now you're kind of like, well, they're going to visit back to America where that reads differently. It reads differently. So I'm wondering if this issue ever comes up. I know it sounds so small and something so, like, as an aside or an afterthought to even discuss when we have such bigger issues to discuss in ideology and philosophy, but I'm wondering how you you approach, how you counsel students in your universe about how to go about that cultural differences in dress.
David, great to be with you. I want to get to your question, but I'll just add two comments to what Shani said, and then I'll relate to your question. So first of all, regarding your first question about modern Orthodoxy and religious Zionism, people often see them as parallel because they overlap in America, and it's understandable they overlap to a certain extent because they're both relatively new phenomena, and how you relate to new phenomena versus tradition, it's a similar access. But obviously, as Shani was explaining, they're totally different issues. Right? One is how you relate to modernity, the other is how you relate to the attempt to return to Israel, the state of Israel. And most importantly, the range within religious Zionism on issues of modern Orthodoxy is much wider than the range within the modern Orthodox community in America. Not just the total range, but the fact that the main, strongest ideological elements within the religious Zionist community are more to the right, as far as modern Orthodoxy is concerned, than even the most right-wing elements in America. Meaning Merkaz, Har HaMor, for sure, and its affiliates are very much to the right on issues of modern Orthodoxy and woke and these kind of things. So that's a very important thing to be aware of.
If you're comfortable, I would also add that the spectrum of observance, even in the leadership in a way, like differing understandings, I think there's almost more diversity in Israel than there is in America, because the population of leaders and who becomes and who wants to contribute in leadership in Israel is much more diverse. There's only a certain kind of person who wants to be an American pulpit rabbi in the Orthodox community. It's a smaller population than it draws upon.
Could be on the leadership level, but on the communal level, I don't think Israel's modern Orthodoxy goes more to the left than America's, although there might be more leadership on the left, as I think you're
fair. Exactly. That's exactly what I meant.
And as far as the second point about the cultural differences, and I'll get to the shirts in a second, I'll tell you a funny story. But as far as the cultural differences, people also speak about how it's often hard for families to come and maintain the same level of religious observance here. I think the two main differences are, number one, the fact that there are elements that are important Jewishly besides Torah or mitzvot in the narrow sense. Obviously, as religious people, we see the army and the state as part of our religious identity, but they are separate elements. And what happened in America, the only way to express your religiosity is through learning Torah and keeping mitzvot. In Israel, there's many people who feel their Jewish identity through the state, the army, etc. And so what happens is you have people who in America might have grown up religious because that would have been their Jewish identity, but here it gets channeled in a different direction. And that's part of the challenge, especially for people making the transition from overseas here. And the second point is that in America, there are, of course, non-religious Jews, but they're not seen by most of the Central Orthodox communities. When you live in the five towns, you're not interacting with Reform and unaffiliated Jews. So basically, there's the Jews who are Orthodox, and then there's the Goyim, which for many Orthodox Jews growing up, and for myself in Flatbush, that included non-religious Jews. They didn't look any different. We didn't know them in any other way.
Sadly, but yeah, that's the truth.
In Israel, the rest of the population is Jewish. They're your brothers and sisters. You're connected to them. And that creates a new challenge, because to say on the one hand, they're my brothers and sisters and we're one people, on the other hand, I'm a Torah Jew and they're not, that's part of the challenge as far as that range. Now to get to your question, without further ado, I'll tell you a funny story, which you'll appreciate along your lines. I remember one of my first years in yeshiva on Rosh Hashanah. I was davening behind an Israeli boy who was wearing, as his external shirt, a Hanes undershirt. The way I know it was Hanes is because I could see the tag through the back of the shirt. And so being, an American and whatever, I went over to him after davening. I said, "Are you sure this is the right shirt for you to be wearing on Rosh Hashanah?" He says, "Absolutely, it's my wedding shirt." He said, "I wore it at my wedding, and I wear it every Rosh Hashanah." So obviously there are cultural differences. I think it's changing, by the way.
That is a fantastic story. I'm so glad you surfaced that. I love like an Israeli Dati wedding, but the formality of it is 100 degrees less than what you have in America. So how do you counsel students in this area?
It's changing. It's becoming more formal, not the same, but more. And the message to students is, for sure before they make Aliyah, every person has to dress in a way that they see as respectable and show the respect for Torah, respect for themselves, and that depends on how you grew up. And the bottom line is, if you grew up in a culture where you express respect in a certain way, to dress otherwise is disrespectful from your end, and you're showing disrespect to something that you want to show respect to, both the Torah you're learning and yourself. Now the question becomes, as you make Aliyah and as you become part of society, do you at some point say, so for myself personally, I grew up, you wear a suit to show that something is a respectable time, and if I was not wearing a suit, I would feel that I was not showing respect. I'm not saying somebody else can't see it otherwise, but for me, I think I'll always wear a suit.
Do you wear a suit and tie when you're in America?
All the time.
He wears a suit and a
All the
tie.
time.
I wear a suit and tie in
every
Israel on
Shabbos
Shabbos.
in Israel, and some of our sons do as well, because that's how we raised them here. We have 4 sons, so it's 2 and 2, some with their suit and tie and 2 of them without their suit and tie. But as you can imagine, also growing up with you in the 5 towns, that's how I was taught. So I dressed my children in elementary school. They always went to school with, their nice pants, their
Collared
button-down
shirt
shirts. 100%. They got to high school, and their particular high school where we sent them to learn very much discouraged them from staying in their button-down shirts. They felt that really was, as you said, a little too American, a little too formal. They have to appreciate and also integrate within the broader Israeli society. And that goes hand in hand with, just as you're mentioning, almost nationally identifying yourself in a certain way. And you remind me of the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's mitzvah speech. You wonder, Moshe ends the mitzvah speech in Parsha Kitzavo with the Mikra Bikurim and Vidoi Maser. The Mikra Bikurim, the proclamation that accompanies bringing the first of the fruits during the agricultural harvesting season, and Vidoi Maser at the ends of 3 years of taking 10%, or the various tithes that are divided and given to the priests and the Levites, that after a 3-year cycle, one also pronounces that one has followed all the laws of the appropriate dividends and commandments associated with them. And the question is, why end an entire speech of commandments with these apparently non sequiturs?
Sure.
One of the answers given, I heard actually from Rabbi Menachem Leibtag, and I use this to help understand and explain the differences between modern Orthodoxy and religious Zionism, that there are 2 ways of identifying ourselves as Jews. One is through Bikurim, our national identity. We speak about our history, how God took us to Egypt and then redeemed us, brought us to the land, and we're giving God a sense of thanksgiving, gratitude by bringing the fruits of the land. The other is by expressing our observance of the covenants of commandments, and that's expressed through the proclamation at the end of the 3 years. And the question is, which one do you place a focus on? Do you focus more on the national identity, our historical, both the past and the future, or do you focus more on the religious observance? And I think in the States and on modern Orthodoxy, or as you identified, not only through dress, but how do I identify myself through what I wear, through the restaurants that I go to, the movies that I see or I don't see. Basically, it's all going to be identified through my observance of mitzvot and the communities that I associate with regard to that religious identity. But there's also a national identity. And as Rav Taragin was saying, when you come here, sometimes the national identity becomes very overwhelming and identifies that we forget to also emphasize the religious observance. But then again, if you look at the States, it's wonderful that there's strong religious observance, but how nationally oriented and conscious are we really when we're not living here and when we're not associating with the broader Israeli national society here?
Even culturally, I think that's very true. And I've become more aware of my distance from Israeli thinkers, from Israeli culture, just even the culture, which again, I'm an extreme Rav cookie, and so I try to find a little bit of beauty in everything, sometimes in too many things, but I can't help it. But I realize how ignorant I am, and which really brings me to the next question, which is really the most important question in a lot of ways. And that is, we're talking about this because of the events of October 7th. And we've seen a lot of the ways that October 7th has raised questions for different segments of our community, how they are reshifting and realigning and reorganizing. And I'm curious specifically for the Dati Leumi community, that really is the bridge between the larger secular Zionist world and also the Torah observant world, both in Israel and in America. In what ways, if at all, has religious Zionism changed since October 7th?
Look, it's an excellent question. It obviously will take time for the dust to settle to truly know, but I can make 2 observations that I think are already things that can be said. The first is that the religious Zionist community sees itself, and I think to a certain extent is being seen as more central to Israel and in playing a leadership role. I think religious Zionists and those who were aware knew even before the war that religious Zionism was making up a large percent of the army. Now it's quantifiable, sadly, in sad ways. And both religious Zionists feel more of a right to be speaking in a leadership position, and society recognizes it whether they want to accept it or not, that religious Zionism is playing a central role in the place where the whole community comes together and what we need most critically, which is to defend ourselves. So I think that's a strong feeling that the religious Zionist community has through these difficulties. The second point that's very interesting, and I think it is a little bit of a difference between Israel and America, is that the religious Zionist community has shifted strongly to the right on issues about our relationship with the Palestinians, with the Arabs, and with the nations of the world. I'm not speaking right now about religious issues, modern Orthodox. I'm speaking
I understand.
about Dati Leumi, and I was shocked and continue to be shocked to see on social media posts by the liberal wing of the religious Zionist community about Hamas Nazis and about the 70 wolves of the world, posts that many of these people I think would have called racist and closed-minded 3 months ago. I think people here are shocked, feel betrayed, feel that they need to protect their most basic existence, and have reverted back to this traditional Jewish feeling of the world is against us, we have only ourselves to rely upon. I don't know if that will stick, but right now, all of Israel, frankly, we're talking about the religious Zionist community, amongst them, there's a more of a shift to the right, which I'm not sure if it's the same or to the same degree in America.
That is profound.
If Reuven was speaking about the political ramifications of religious Zionists moving more to the right, then it's also remarkable to see and to focus on the religious aspect, meaning even those who identified as nationalistic have become more religious. And I'm sure you've seen this and heard this, meaning both the traditional Sephardim, but even those who were in religious families and left now reassociating. And it's not just through the pairs of tefillin and through Shema Yisrael and through the tzitzit tying that has been rampant, Baruch Hashem, in Eretz Yisrael. I think it's also, as Reuven said, just an association with the religious young men and women in the army, where they see with their own eyes the valor, the strength, the pride going in, and it inspires others, not only politically, but religiously. But I think getting back to the broader topic, it's also, and this is a little bit of some of the disappointments or the recognition of the rifts between modern Orthodoxy in America and religious Zionists here, that until now, there really was a greater association, and I see this through so many of the students that are here, that those that are here and they're continuing to learn in their respective yeshivot and seminaries, but at the same time, they don't fully grasp what it means that your children's lives are on the line. And as much as people are in the States, and just as you said, perhaps feeling, I don't know if it's, these compunctions or, Shlomo Zucker like to call it the absenteeism that you feel, it highlights that difference with regard to really putting our families, our lives, those values that we believe in. So in Chutz La'aretz, you may believe as a modern Orthodox Jew, very involved in society and standing up even for those values of Zionism. But now that distinction is very clear and different when you look at the sacrifices that are made for those values.
Generally, people are able to identify with others when they're able to almost imagine themselves in that position. And since October 7th, it's nearly unimaginable. I'll just talk on behalf of myself to imagine, forget about serving in the army. It's unimaginable because of my own deficiencies and limitations. And it's even more unimaginable to have a child who is serving in the army. And it's much more imaginable what you see and where America has galvanized, which is in the areas that are so commendable and, God forbid, not with an ounce of cynicism of making tzitzis and tefillin and sending money and packages and doing visits. It's much easier to identify with those who are kind of like setting up the barbecue rather than those who we're barbecuing for, which in many ways highlights what I think has been an older issue of American Jewry having a harder time to really embrace and imagine what the religious Zionist life demands of us. It's much easier to imagine a life in Israel where we're either full-time in Kollel or working a job that has an American office. But the weight that the religious Zionist community has been carrying, not beginning October 7th, it's just publicly since October 7th, of really on the front lines, both in terms of war, but also not as a Kiruv project. It's almost easier to celebrate a secular soldier than a religious Zionist soldier, to be quite honest with you, because I have a purpose in relation to a secular soldier. I can make them tzitzis because the first time in their life they're thinking of wearing tzitzis. I can encourage tefillin usage because, now I have something that they don't now have, an appreciation of tefillin and mitzvos. But I have very little to offer a religious Zionist soldier, aside from obviously continue giving money, continue sending packages, continue giving support. But my place and position vis-a-vis that community is much more hard to imagine. Where can I contribute? Which is why I think a lot of Americans fall to the default where they're able to identify or at least have a relationship. I know what my relationship can be to a secular Israeli soldier. I know what my relationship can be to a Haredi community. Where do I fit in if I'm talking of David Beshefkin, who's a full-on wimp? I mean that in a real way. I'm a coward across the board to think, where would my place be to really be building and contributing to the security of the state of Israel? So I'm wondering, as, again, both of you serve not only in your respective yeshivas and seminaries, but also as the educational directors of Mizrachi, what steps do you make to translate the experience and the awe of the experience of Israel to an American audience? You're trying to encourage religious Zionism in America to an American modern Orthodox community, but sometimes you're faced with a double-edged sword. If you really tell them what it's like and what you really need to shoulder, people are going to run in the other direction. So you have to kind of paper it over with an Americanized, you could keep your job, move to Beit Shemesh, economic, startup nation. That's palatable for an American audience. But on the flip side, part of the beauty of what you represent, of what this community represents, is the fact that they are on the front lines in two very different arenas, both in terms of the development of Torah and the development of the security of the IDF, of people who are standing guard on the borders and going into places like Gaza to defend the Jewish people. How do you approach what I look at as a translation educational issue?
Well, that was a lot.
Yes.
I'll try and relate to each one of the issues. The first issue you mentioned, which is, in my opinion, the most important thing for your listeners to understand, and it's hard to understand, is what everyone, not some, everyone in the religious Zionist and secular community in Israel are experiencing. Just about every person here has multiple first-degree relatives on the front lines in Gaza who they're not hearing from. They have a son, a father, sadly in these circumstances, brothers. Not only that they have, their brother has, their neighbor has, everyone they know has, people they're terrified for. We daven together, we worry together, we hear the announcements of those killed and wounded together. We all hold our breath together. This is a unique circumstances where everyone in these communities, everyone is feeling it. And it's hard to describe it. I don't think Shani and I understood it in the past when we didn't have children old enough or nephews old enough to be on the front. So when I talk about whether Americans or those without kids at the front understand it, I know what it's like because I was once that person, even though I lived in Israel. What's unique about this war is that it's not 1,000 or 10,000 soldiers. It's everyone's children, fathers, and brothers from these communities. And so everyone's feeling it together. In Yeshivat HaKotel, the Rosh Yeshiva has 7 children on the front. Every Rebbe has children on the front. 5 of my Rebbe and my colleagues are on the front from the yeshiva. My son's high school, they sent us a notification that 34 of their staff members were drafted, just explaining to us the challenges of running their high schools.
And you have children now. You have children of age.
We have 3, and my brother Moshe has 6, on the various fronts.
Sure.
So you feel it. That's regarding the first thing, just to understand that people really, it's something you can't understand until you're in that situation. Because I know I didn't. You can sympathize, but it's hard to feel it. As far as your second question, what can you do there besides sending money and etc.? I want to say something very important, and it's part of a longer maybe conversation that you want to get into. This is the first war where a large percentage of the fighters are B'nai Torah. Our B'nai Torah, our Rosh Yeshiva, our Rabbeim, our big Talmidei Chacham. You had small units in the Yom Kippur War and the Lebanon War. Now it's a huge percentage. And Baruch Hashem, the state of Israel has produced yeshivot and institutions that encourage high-level Torah learning and that encourage supporting the state. It's such a beautiful thing to see these Jews, religious Jews, fully committed to Torah and mitzvot, and the shilos Rav Rimon is getting, which show you the kinds of chayalim we're dealing with. And he keeps speaking about it. The Jews in America should appreciate that, should celebrate that, should frankly support it, should realize that emerging in the state of Israel is a form of a Ben Torah and a citizen who can build a state and defend the state as a Ben Torah. And that's something we didn't have as a people for thousands of years. Rav Rimon says, and we don't know historically, there may never have been this number of B'nai Torah fighting on behalf of the Jewish people. And we're not taking anything away from, B'nai Torah who don't fight or other kinds of Jews. Every Jew is valuable. But to celebrate and appreciate these people and these organizations and institutions. And it's not just a question of where people send their donations in the next year. It's also a question of realizing as a people what we have and what's going on, and hopefully celebrating, supporting, and teaching our communities about the direction we want to go in as far as the Geula and the future of the Jewish people. That's, I think, the most important thing as far as your second point. As far as your third point, educating people who are here and running the other way, so to speak. I think there's two kinds of American students here. There are the ones in schools where they don't have Israelis and the ones where they do. I think the ones in yeshivot with Israelis, especially the ones where they're close with the Israelis, are having an experience that helps them appreciate Israel on the deepest level. I can say in Shivat HaKotel, but it's not only Shivat HaKotel, I'm just speaking from personal experience. The Madrichim, the boys had in Elul, are fighting now. One of the Madrichim sent today a message to the group that one of the guys in his unit was hit by an RPG and he's in serious condition. Everyone should please daven for him. This is their Madrich, who they know. They're seeing it for real. And I think we have to show people what Israel really is and help them appreciate it. If they're not ready to make aliyah to that, that's understandable. But one of the problems is when people make aliyah to the Golden Medina and then they find out that it's a different Medina. And I can tell you that my students who see it are inspired by it, not intimidated by it, because they're seeing real life and the Jewish people building a real life in their country. So I'm not sugarcoating it. I want them to see what it is. And I think, if anything, the students this year are getting a stronger, more prideful model for themselves of what the state of Israel is.
As the educational directors of Mizrachi, we really did want to meet the challenge, recognizing that it's imperative that the communities from Chutz La'aretz be able to not only relate, but that they'll be able to learn from these experiences as well. So I want to focus on one hand on not just the sympathizing, but the participation, and on one hand, the pain that we're experiencing, but at the same time, literally witnessing a shining through that pain. And therefore, I think it is imperative, firstly, to train the leaders of communities in Chutz La'aretz. And what I mean by train is give them the hands-on, not only taking them down south to Be'eri and to Kfar Aza and let them see the results of the massacre and intellectually being able to understand what happened, but also to internalize the identity, the strengthening of identity through literally giving up your lives, sacrificing everything, jobs, university degrees, your funds, your sons, and your spouses. And you hear all the heroes and the heroines speaking about this. When you witness it firsthand, the witnessing is so much stronger than everything that you hear. When community leaders ask me, Shani, we've raised $10,000. Should we just send this to the army or should we organize a mission? I say certainly the latter. Come and you'll see and you'll appreciate and you'll understand if we're speaking about identity and how we want to identify ourselves, not just as Jewish community in the diaspora or in Israel, how as a nation of Israel, how do we truly identify ourselves? Do we see ourselves as connected to this land? Is this simply another army that's defending itself? And on one hand, you hear this all the time, Israel has a right to defend itself. But do you see that this is an army of David HaMelech? That Tanakh comes to life here, and you're not fully associating and embracing the values of Torah Judaism unless you're here and you participate with literally your dam and your nefesh, your blood and your soul. So I think the training of leadership, halabai, if we could only bring all the communities here, but to have leaders come and see and return back, I think that on another level is obviously social media, what you see, what you hear, and defending Israel advocacy groups, certainly confronting anti-Semitism associated so strongly with anti-Zionism, not just on campuses, but in communities. Reuven just came back last night from Chutz La'aretz, and I asked him if he was in Teaneck and the Five Towns. So we're talking about the bubbles of Jewish communities, and I asked him if he felt any anti-Semitism. And as you know, he goes numerous times a year, and he said yes, and noted a few different instances. And if we can not only bring people, educate, strengthen them on social media to share these messages. But here comes my real pet peeve, David, because you yourself said it, and had you not opened that Pandora's box, perhaps I would have ignored it. But but you said you're somewhat of a coward. And I'm sorry, my husband's laughing because he knows that it's not just my ideal. This is the ideal of the Jewish people. How can we not see this as, on one hand, a time of crisis, but at the same time, a remarkable opportunity? If this is not the modern knocking on the door, and you can turn to Black Lives Matter and the rise of anti-Semitism and COVID, I'll be honest with you, I don't understand anymore how Jews can sit, and as you know, my family is there also, and I love them.
No one loves the Finers more than me.
No, me.
Outside of the Finers.
I win. Okay, I'm glad that you're on the cheering committee because they definitely deserve it. My parents are truly remarkable. And at the same time, I don't understand anymore. When you said also we can make a list of excuses, but looking at the stories of Tanakh and Jewish history, how can we not respond to these knocks right now? How can we just ignore our brothers and sisters? And my husband is saying, yes, Shani, you talk about this all the time. And I know, thank God, that Nefesh B'Nefesh, the applications have risen. I think they said 400%. How many are really going to follow through with that? How many are going to see that we need the numbers here also? And with every Nefesh, really, that's lost, we have to bring more and more here. We've been davening, and the strength of everyone's tefillot and tehillim from across the globe, I know, is felt here. It's felt here and has ramifications here. You say, Tekah b'shofar gadol l'chayrutenu, we scream and beseech God for ultimate redemption, salvation. So I turn to Hashem. I'll be honest, my personal prayers have become much more Chana-like, indignant and audacious. And I turn to Hashem, come on, God, it's time, just time to do something so that the world will see, so that the Jews across the world will see that this is really the time to catalyze the process, to be not those spectators, but those players in the fields. And then I realized, you know what, God, take it back. You're doing a great job and really doing everything necessary to wake everyone up. The question is whether or not. It's not just those sparks of Zionism, it's those sparks of observance, it's those sparks of knowing that Jewish identity is linked to this land, whether that's going to be enough to bring people back. I really wasn't going to be so...
No, I fully agree with it, and I appreciate it. One practical thing, my personal thesis is that a lot of the barrier, especially with the Dati Leumi community, is cultural. I remember when I was studying in Yeshivat Shalavim, there was a painting on the back of one of the dorms, a beautiful painting of early religious Zionist leaders. And as an American, I could only identify one person, Rav Kook. There were other leaders there who I had never seen before. And here's the saddest part. People explained to me, oh no, that's a picture of, I remember one was Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria, but there were names that even when they told me the name, I said, I have no idea who that is. I didn't grow up in Bnei Akiva. So I think the work that you've done to bring even a Rev Rimon, who we've had on the podcast, and I know you've done so much more work to bring him on the radar, but we need so much more than that. So our view of what a Jewish leader looks like is not just exclusively with the leaders of the European Rosh Yeshivas. I'm not saying take them off your walls, God forbid. And I'm not, God forbid, saying take off your walls the leaders that we have in America. But being able to almost, and I hate to say the word, but to market the Gedolim of the religious Zionist community to Americans so they even know who they are of this generation and generations past, where I think a lot of people are lost. Which really leads me to a question that's extraordinarily sensitive, but you've done remarkable work. I look at both of you as expert translators because you know the American experience, you know the Israel experience. You are at a point of transition where translation is most important, educating people in their upper teens, early 20s. And you've done a lot of incredible work, particularly Rabbi Taragin, of building broad coalitions throughout the community. You've had these fame events. Whenever a poster would drop, it would be very, who'd they get now? You'd have every single major personality and speaker across the world coming to these incredible events that really became popular, I believe, during Corona, maybe it was even before then. And my question is, have we become closer together or farther apart? Where it was much easier to talk about Achdus in the conceptual sense when everybody had a role to play and there was not an active army taking our children's, our colleagues to the front lines. How do you approach this, particularly in relation to the Haredi Haredi community, which I think some of the rifts were also highlighted in America. The American yeshiva community, I think, in many ways is the most apart because they're not in dialogue directly with the soldiers. They're in America. And you see that dissonance, or you see the gap in the ideals that once upon a time felt extraordinarily close together, almost imperceptibly the same. And you've done a lot of work highlighting that, how we all are a part of the same community. So how are you navigating some of the very real differences, particularly as it relates to army service, in a world where the communal differences between the Dati Leumi community and the Haredi community are ever more pronounced?
Look, that's the big question. When I worked on Achenu, when the war broke out, we spoke about it on the Achdus program around the war. I spoke to many Gedolei Torah. Of course, they all are very supportive. One, Rav Yitzchak Berkowitz, who was very, very supportive and encouraged me very strongly to move things forward. He said, it's clear that Kadosh Baruch Hu allowed this to happen because of our disunity. And if we don't unify now, Kadosh Baruch Hu has to ask himself, how much worse does it need to get? And that's a scary thought. Murder, butchering of 1,300 people, hundreds of hostages, and now hundreds of Chayalim killed. Is that not enough to bring us together? And just to summarize what the situation is right now, in general, I think many people value Achdut, are talking from an Achdus perspective, but the issues are still simmering and haven't gone away. And I think there's still recrimination. Everyone blames everyone else for what's going on. Very few people blame themselves. And of course, it's their fault, meaning everyone agrees it's the other person's fault. That's a very difficult situation, and I'm fearful about where things are going to be in general, not just regarding the yeshivish world. What you said regarding the yeshivish world, so first of all, I have great respect for the yeshivish world and their Gedolei Torah, our Gedolei Torah, community deeply committed to Avodas Hashem and Torah and mitzvos. But there's a big challenge here. You mentioned how the American community might be more challenging. To a certain extent, for the American community, it's less challenging because it's not like they're not doing the army, they are doing the army.
That's why it's more challenging. They don't have the friction of movement. There's less friction in America.
They're not facing the issue, but they're also not facing the finger that's being pointed at them.
Correct.
Just to speak about for a second, so obviously what I said before about how everyone's feeling it, it's different, obviously, in the Haredi community in Eretz Yisrael. And we feel it when we interact with people in that community. For example, I spoke to someone right after the war broke out, someone in Ramat Beit Shemesh, and they said to me, so what's going on? I didn't even know how to start answering that question because in our community, we all know what's going on. I got an email from an organization I'm working with. They wanted to meet with me about something. And I said, things are very busy right now. Can we meet at a later time? And they wrote back, what's busy right now? Meaning just they're not experiencing it the same way. And the hardest part has been a lot of statements that have come out from the yeshivish world, from Gedolei Torah, that are very hurtful to the broader community whose children are out there. You know, the Chayalim are garbage men. They shouldn't be supported. And I want to share with you a beautiful story of Rav Hartman from London. Yeah. Rav Hartman has a tremendous Avas Yisrael and a tremendous Avas Eretz Yisrael. And he told me that during the Lebanon War, he was in Sanhedrin Morchevet, and they collected 2,000 kilo, 4,000 pounds of cake for the soldiers. And there was a woman there who felt it was inappropriate. Why should we be supporting the soldiers? And she went to Rav Elyashiv, the great Rav Elyashiv. And she asked him whether they should be collecting cake for the soldiers. Rav Elyashiv said, only a mother who doesn't have a child in Lebanon could ask such a question. And I think what he was saying was, put aside the shitas, the ideology, and it could be that the yeshivish world is doing the right thing by not serving, but to understand what people are going through, the sympathy and empathy. I remember when there was a statement regarding the rally, came out at the time of the rally, that they shouldn't write letters to the Chayalim, and it celebrates the Chayalim. On one of the rabbinic lists that I'm in, there was such a tremendous amount of pain. And one of the rabbis from America reached out to me, a very fine, from Rav, he said, my son was wounded on October 7th. I didn't even realize he had a son in the army. He said, it's so hard for me to hear this. And this is a person who I know personally has great respect for the people saying it. So it's not just whether you serve or not, but also whether you understand what the rest of the country is experiencing in your interaction with them. And that, I think, is an even bigger issue. And what we're going to need after the war, just to answer your question, we're going to need great people, maybe not political people. We're going to need great people who truly understand and respect one another, who can sit down together and figure out what covenant, what agreement, what understanding these very diverse Jews and non-Jews, but definitely Jews, can reach where we understand each other, we accept each other, we can figure out how all these pieces work together. Because just one more statement. Right now, everyone has their shita. They live according to their shita, and that's your problem if you don't like my shita.
I just want to remind our listeners, the word shita means religious outlook.
The question is, how do you build a country together where everyone has their own shtibble, but we have to function as a country? Because you can't build a country out of
shtibbles.
There are stakes.
That works in America, exactly as you were saying.
Well, even in America, you sometimes have the issue. You know, if everyone has their own shtibble, the 5 tenths, but then we have to have a kashrus organization, right? And then you have issues. Kal v'chomer, when you're building a country which is much more than a kashrus organization, how do we do it when we're different? And the only way that can happen is if people understand it's not just my shitta, it's understanding how we work together with a country that has different shittas. And I think, like Shani was saying before, this is a big crisis that's sharpened the issues and the differences, and it'll either, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, be something people learn from and come together, and we don't even want to mention the alternative, because that's what it needs to be.
Yeah, so with all the, I'm going to say, the rifts that we feel and the sharpening, as I think you're hearing, of the differences, both between the more yeshivish, Haredi versus more religious national sectors here, in addition to also the sharpening of differences between diasporan religious communities and the religious national communities here, which I think was really the starting point of this entire discussion. With all that, I do want to focus on the positive, and that is that this war has also been providing, as Rav Taragin alluded to, a phenomenal opportunity. Once you hear the dissonance, you also have to try to search for some type of resonance. You have to ask yourself, what really are my values? Because just a few months ago, and we obviously were getting along, on one hand, obviously a lot of disunity, but very much, I'm going to say, as a religious Zionist, very much subscribing to the values of Torah learning, of a strong Torah lifestyle. And all of a sudden, now that the issues are sharpening, question is, in both communities, what really are those strong values? And in speaking to many members of, and especially women from across the Haredi yeshiva spectrum and diasporan Jewry as well, to hear those that truly are rethinking. They're rethinking their values. They're rethinking what they stand for. And even if it doesn't necessarily mean that, tomorrow their son is going to be drafting, even though there are many who have, encouraged their children, the pride, the interest, the, going to the bases of the Chayalim, showing the support with all the criticism on one hand, I think the majority of the communities are really thinking about how we can come together. And in addition to, as Rav Taragin was saying, having great people, I think people are also learning across the board a sense of humility. And the people who will come together, who are the majority, you're always going to have the fringes and the extremes on the side.
Sure.
The major voice is going to be one not only of achdut, not only of unity, but people being more amenable and respectful of different opinions, and recognizing that we really do share so much and we're willing to give so much to stay here and to prosper here. I think that can bring to great things. Speaking of Rabbi Ramon, I know that he's already working on this, trying to bring particularly people in social media and journalists together to be able to project that voice as loudly as possible.
I'll just add one point, David, to what Shani said, and it's an interesting tension and issues for the yeshivish community here. I think the hearts of the bulk of the yeshivish community are with the soldiers, are with the struggle, as Shani said.
Sure.
I think there's a difference between the Hasidish community and the Litvish community. For sure in Israel, maybe in Chutz La'aretz. The Hasidish community, I think there's even more of an outpouring of emotion and of Herzkeit towards, and less of the question of Shita. And I think there's a big issue within the yeshivish community, which again I have great respect for, and we have to continue to find the ways to work together however we can, between Amcha, the people, and many of the leaders. I know I hear from a lot of people how they're feeling it and they're identifying, and some of the leadership is trying to pull that back, fearful of what it may, how it may impact. There was a very strong podcast, I assume you heard David Lichtenstein, where he interviewed Rav Asher Weiss.
Cannot believe that you're broadcasting David Lichtenstein's podcast. I'm joking. He's an old friend. He's wonderful.
Both of your podcasts are excellent, each one in their own way. But meaning Rav Asher Weiss was very upset, particularly at the leadership. He's had a line where he said people are afraid if they support the Chayalim that people will draft. He said, how insecure are we with our ideology that we're afraid that if we give credit to the Chayalim, our people will draft. He goes, if that's all we are, we should be embarrassed. And he said something along the lines of, Rosh Yeshiva are afraid of that, should give in the keys and hand over to somebody else to do the job. So I think there is a fear, on the leadership level. And the question is how you balance that, because I think the hearts of Klal Yisrael naturally feel for each other. A famous medrash which says the Jewish people are like a sheep. When one part gets hit, everyone feels it. So I think emotionally, people feel it. Question is how that translates, especially in the yeshivish world where the leaders are leaders. How does that translate as far as the future of us being one people, with different opinions about how to apply things?
Women in particular across society, and again, I mean both in Israel and abroad, are playing a vital role in this regard. And it's not just because righteous women in every generation are the ones who catalyze and precipitate redemption, but it's because because women have so much shared in common, whether it's through tefillah, whether it's through shiurei Torah, different Torah classes. I'm sure you've heard and seen across the religious spectrum the remarkable numbers of hafrashot challah ceremonies, of separating from the challah to bring back the hostages, to protect the soldiers, beautiful stories of lighting Shabbos candles, I'm going to say camaraderie and sisterhood that has been broadcast and truly felt. And I see that also in the missions that come, in bringing women's missions through Mizrachi, through Matan, to see that it's a sense of, when you hug and dance with the Israeli female soldiers, there's just all the mechitzot, all the barriers seem to fall. There's something about this camaraderie. And if we were speaking about religious Zionism before, I think that the same is very clear within the religious Zionist spectrum amongst the women as well. You definitely feel it. And it could be that this is part of the divide that you're hearing, even in what we're saying, that when it comes to the men, the army becomes so much of a significant part. Not that there aren't women, as you know, in the army, but there's so much more that bonds and binds the women in Am Yisrael together. So albeit there are different sentiments, and it's hurtful when you know that your sons are there on the front lines, but at the same time, when you see them crying and praying together and organizing and doing as much as they can, it definitely is encouraging.
That instinct, I think you are incredibly prescient and correct, that it is the instinct of mothers coming together who understand viscerally, nothing needs to be explained to them, what it's like connecting to other mothers who probably are best suited to kind of serve as leaders in bridging this divide and explaining the empathy and the shared responsibility. I do hope that there is a new covenant of sorts between the different communities being able to come together and realize and understand. Again, I think a lot of this has to do with American educational systems and reassessing the models, even the pictures of who we have on our walls, to almost be more inclusive of the leaders who are not only leading us in Torah, but people who are leading us in defense of Amcha Yisrael, of Jews in Israel. And I personally have had a transformation that I covered Zionism 6 or 7 months ago on 1840, and I was Mr. Eretz Yisrael, the land of our forefathers, and I almost avoided the state of Israel as a term because it was so cold. It was so not the upbringing that I had. And I think what October 7th has changed for me is we need to be all in on the state of Israel. That doesn't mean we have to agree with every politician or every coalition or every Knesset. We have been given a gift by history, and that is a Jewish state in Israel. And we are either part of ensuring that it is defended, that it is cultivated, that it continues to grow and thrive, or you're elsewhere. And we need more Jews who appreciate the gift that the state of Israel offers. And at the heart of that gift and preserving that gift really is the Dati Leumi community and your work as translators, both within Israel and I think in many ways, more importantly, in making sure that the translation sticks to our brothers and sisters in the diaspora in America through your work in Mizrachi is so incredibly important, and I am so grateful to both of you for your work in this area.
Let me make 2 points to you, Rav David, about the 2 things you said. The first thing I'm going to tell you may surprise a lot of your listeners, okay? The first generation of Rashi Yeshiva and the Hesder Yeshivas were people who came from outside the world of Hesder Yeshivas because there were none. Rav Goldich came from Bnei Brak, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein came from New York, Rav Adari came from Hebron Yeshiva, etc. Today's generation of Rashi Yeshiva and Hesder fought in Israeli wars. Rav Sabato from Alei Adumim wrote a powerful book about he and his colleagues in Yom Kippur War. I recommend people reading it.
That's been translated. Do you know the name of the English translation of the book?
Adjusting
Sights.
Koren published it. Beautiful.
Rav Baruch Vider, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat HaKotel, and others, I'm just using it as an example, fought in the Lebanon War. Rav Vider's tank was hit by 2 missiles. It was a miracle he survived. Rav Rimon and others, I'm just giving a few examples, fought in wars. The Hesder Yeshivas have shown that people can be high-level Talmidei Chachamim Rashi Yeshiva and also defend the country. That's a tremendous thing. And like you said, people in America don't even know their names.
It's worse. It's worse because what scares me, and I've mentioned this before, if I were to ask your average American yeshiva student, name me a Rosh Yeshiva or a Talmud Chacham, a scholar on the caliber of Rosh Yeshiva, who is also a multimillionaire, I guarantee you they'd be able to come up with 3 or 4 names. The people who are Gvirim and Talmidei Chachamim, because that is an aspiration that a lot of people have. But name me one Rosh Yeshiva who fought in in a war, I am worried that most Americans could not name you one. And that to me is sad.
I'm sure you're
Because
right.
the shtei shulchanos of this generation should not be material, financial wealth, and also a Talmud Chacham. The shtei shulchanos should be that I'm on the shulchan of Torah and mitzvos, and my second shulchan is that I have a shulchan where I have took up arms to defend the Jewish people in the state of Israel.
The second point I wanted to make, and I think it's a very important point, and it'll connect back to the beginning of the conversation when you spoke about the difference between America and Israel, Modern Orthodox, Religious Zionism. Rav Soloveitchik wrote about the individual, lonely man of faith, halachic man. Rav Kook wrote about the world, being part of Am Yisrael, being part of God's creation. Israel is about transcending oneself, being something bigger. And of course, both are necessary. One of the challenges in Israel is that there are many people who are very into nationalism but don't build their own individualistic identity. One of the big challenges in America, in the Modern Orthodox community, is our schools and our shuls support Israel. There's no one within our community who doesn't support Israel, but they don't see it as a basic part of their religious identity. Their religious identity is their learning of Torah, their Kiyum Mitzvos, their Hasidus, Neo-Hasidus, etc. Israel, of course, that's Eretz Yisrael, the state of Israel we support, and that's a major difference. And the only way anything will change is if and when the community in America, the Rosh Yeshiva, the Rabbanit, see Eretz Yisrael. Just to sharpen the contrast for you for a second with something Shani mentioned, the Dvar Torah. Rav Chanan Wasserman, the great Talmud of the Chafetz Chaim, was asked in his Sefer Ikvisa de Meshicha,
The Footsteps of Messiah. I'm shocked that you're quoting Rabbi Chanan on Zionism. This episode is taking a turn, but let's see what his answer was.
You'll see why. He said Zionism is avodah zarah, idol worship. Then they asked him, how do you see religious Zionism? He said it's idol worship and serving God at the same time. Now, what does that mean and how do we respond? I think Rav Chanan understood, and I'm not going to get into the whole background. Avodah zarah, idol worship, is anything you're committed to that isn't godly. If you're serving God, that's serving God. If you have a secular sense of nationalism, that's some other God. That's idol worship. The initial religious Zionists, part of the problem was they were religious and they were Zionists. Their Zionism came from secular society. So when Rav Chanan looked at them, he saw religion and he saw avodah zarah, idol worship. The big challenge for religious Zionism in Israel has been to make sure that we're religious people who see Israel, Zionism, as part of our religion. In Israel, the challenge is on one side of the spectrum. On America, the challenge is on the other side of the spectrum. Because in Israel, the challenge is, how do we make sure the Zionism we believe in is part of our religion? In America, the question is, how do we make sure to see that our religion includes Eretz Yisrael and Zionism? And that's the big challenge. If you want to talk about how do we bridge the gap, it's when Israelis see the full picture and Americans see the full picture. Your qualm about not seeing these Gedolim on the wall and not seeing that as one of the Shulchanos really begins with that. Do we value Israel not as a safe haven, right? Many religion people could see eye to eye with Herzl.
Correct.
And not as a nice state where Jews live on the other side of the world and there's kollels.
And the Inbal.
But a central part of our religious identity.
I think educationally, what you said before about the antidote perhaps being the exposure of communities, especially in the diaspora, to the religious Zionist leadership. I think it's not just about the exposure to the leaders, nor to learning the history, nor to even understanding it philosophically. These all contribute. I think particularly for the 18, 19-year-olds, I think for, if I may say, the younger generation, I think that they need to meet their peers. They need to meet these 18, 19-year-olds that have been giving up their lives. They need to go to some of these Shiva houses and actually hear. You would go to Ephraim Jackman's Shiva and hear how he would wake up at 6 o'clock every morning and learn Torah in Yerucham with tremendous focus and still maximize his time to compose music and still learn while he's in his tank and write his Chidushay Torah every 3 moments. And it's not, I'm just using one that just went to visit their Shiva, but this is each morning when you wake up and you see the religious Zionist soldier, another Hester boy that fell, and hearing the eulogies. This could have been another Rosh Yeshiva, another leader of the community. Let them see that these are their peers, that they can synthesize both. And just as you said, instead of presenting not only a portrait and not only a model of a gevir, of the financial aspirations. Let them meet these young men and see that they can do both. If I can just share an anecdote of our son when he was drafted to the army right after Pesach a few months ago. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Tzalash organization that provides for Torah resources while the soldiers are in the army. So there was a siyum, there was a completion of a track date, and they were all dancing and singing. And our son was in the dancing for a little while, and then he went aside, and we asked him, his name is Shmuel, Shmuel, why aren't you still dancing? He said, because now I'm not going to be learning with the same focus as I did when I was in yeshiva. And I have a little bit of jealousy for those who are staying in yeshiva for another year, 2 years, those that aren't necessarily giving up their time in the army. And we asked him, do you have any regrets going to the army? He said, absolutely not. These are the values of the shlichut, literally the responsibility that we have here. And I was thinking to myself, wow, we did an okay job. We did okay. Giving them a sense of that responsibility, of that both achrayut and arivut, as Reuven said, not just for the individual, but for the people. And I wish that Jews across the world can be inspired by young men as these. And it's true that it's trickled down from leadership, but if we can also engage more with their peers, I think that would make a long-term difference.
Just to agree with Shani and bring home the point a little bit. So first of all, again, only saying this for you to appreciate what we're talking about. Our son Shmuel, my wife mentioned, finished Shas in high school.
Wow.
Learned this tremendous hasmada in his first 2 years in yeshiva. And now he carries a huge machine gun. It's called a Negev. And it's such a strange thing to see someone who you know is a masmid and working on his own avodas Hashem, who's there, with his sleeves rolled up in the dirt, defending us.
He's one of many.
He's one of many, yes. I just want to agree with what Shani said, and it's so important, and it's an important, I think, point for your listeners. I went to a high school, not important which one, which was officially Modern Orthodox, Zionistic, etc. I didn't know what a tikva was. I had no feelings towards Israel, beyond just it was a place where Jews lived, that, it wasn't Zionistic. My exposure to Eretz Yisrael came through the older Israeli boys I learned with. One of them was Yosef Tzvi Ramon, now known as Rav Ramon, but others also.
Sure.
The way that impacted me was, I knew that I was frum, right? I was religious, I was observant. And here I saw guys who were frummer than I was, better at learning than I was, and had a broader perspective than I had. And that hit me. That took me out of my bubble. I think it's unfortunate that today, most of the young men and women who go to Israel don't have that interaction with Israeli peers. Because I think peers are different than rebbes. Peer is someone who you can truly identify with and learn from, especially if they're a little bit older. And I think the American system has to think about to what extent they want the year in Israel to really be a year in Israel. It's nothing to do with whether you make Aliyah or not. Please, let's make that crystal clear. To me, what's critical is not whether someone makes Aliyah. Question is whether they get Eretz Yisrael in their heart. And I think in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, when guys, girls went to these kinds of schools, they came back with this chush for Eretz Yisrael. Even when I speak to you and, you mentioned that you didn't know who Rav Neria was, it's clear it had an impact on you that you carry 25, whatever number of years later, a kesher with Eretz Yisrael. And I'm not so sure that that's happening as much today. And when we talk about the war and how much it's impacting or not impacting American society, and I think in America, people are, like you said, feeling more connected to what's going on in Israel. Question is whether that's going to spill over educationally into the schools,
yes,
into the year in Israel. And you mentioned Mizrachi. That's what Mizrachi's working on. It's not about Aliyah. It's about connecting people to Israel. Just to add one more point. Rav Soloveitchik, who was, of course, the gadol of the Modern Orthodox community, was also the president of Mizrachi in America.
Sure.
And the impassioned drushot he gave about Israel, you read that, it's hard to find someone in Israel who gave drushot as passionate as those. And that's why they were translated into Hebrew. Recently, Mizrachi and the OU put out a volume of those drushot, from the Boydom, from the closets that they found. And you read that, people who have that connection with Israel cry. And I think for many people, when they read that, they don't understand it. And the question is whether the American community, not whether Israelis coming, visiting from Israel, want to encourage people, whether the American younger leadership wants to take advantage of this opportunity and say, we have to figure out how to get Eretz Yisrael more central within our identity. Because, for example, Rav Hershel Schachter Shlita, Eretz Yisrael for him, big deal. He starts crying every time you talk about it. Rav Mordechai Willig, who was here during the 6-Day War in Kerem B'Yavne, it's a big deal for him.
If people read Rav Schechter's works more carefully, they would even realize that he is somewhat of a radical Messianic Zionist.
Yes.
If you got to read him carefully, read Bikvei Atzon carefully. He does not hold back. But, I'll be honest with you, when I hear you speak, it makes me sad. I don't think I'm cynical. I am just, maybe I'm living in America. I'm closer. The younger younger generation and even that year in Israel, I think has created a bubble that is so strong that preserves a certain type of American Orthodox culture that, thank God, has become so successful where it is quote unquote cool to be Orthodox in America. Thank you, Hashem, man on the street. It's cool, restaurants. The culture is so much stronger than it was in the 70s, 80s, or 90s. And to me, what has changed is that American Orthodox Judaism has gotten so strong that our bubble has become nearly impenetrable. It is very hard to penetrate. And spending a year in Israel is not going to do it, in my opinion. I think something else needs to happen that's more immersive, more serious at a younger age to really appreciate, number one, what Israel and the vision of what Israel offers, and to realize, and I hate to say this, I'm going to say it, you don't have to agree with me, I'm not going to take your silence as implicit agreement. American Judaism is kind of boring. We're just replacing ourselves. We're not building anything. We are just trying to give the next generation the same life that we grew up with, and it is becoming very tired. It's becoming very defensive, just preserving the level that we have, which is not a small matter because my grandparents had to sacrifice a great deal to even have anything. But these generations, I don't know, the word I use, it has gotten a little bit boring. It feels like it's Groundhog's Day, especially American Orthodoxy. Haven't I seen this movie before? Is this just the same movie but with more pizza stores? It's not compelling to me, and we need a generation to start to realize that.
So David, I'm so happy you said this, so now I can just corroborate everything that you said. But I'm going to begin with a personal moment. I go back also very often to teach in Frisch, to teach in YU, and just a few months ago, I was at the corner of Lexington and right in front of the Stern Building, and it was a rainy day, and I had a deja vu moment. I said, wait a second, I remember standing here exactly like this, walking up the same stairs into the Stern lobby, which has changed a little, and I realized, oh my, it's the same as it was 30 years ago. And American Jewry really is the same. And if you already incorporated Rav Kook was one who spoke not about the past and not just about maintaining the traditions and the identity of the past, but really creating a trajectory of Am Yisrael for the future. And with regard to everything that we can do, I agree with you that there's so many summer camps. Thank God we have the opportunity to be involved in Camp Moshava during the summers. It's camps, it's the year in Israel. It's educators going back and forth like they did during the time of the Amoraim. And yet, at the same time, I agree with you, there still is a certain comfortability. There still is a certain smugness that's felt in Jewish communities in the diaspora, not so much in Europe, by the way. I think there they do recognize that there's need for change and that they're a little backwards on many levels, both academically in terms of Torah scholarship, but also in terms of anti-Semitism and seeing writing on the wall. And as you were speaking and you were talking about the bubble that's been created and a certain status quo, the Groundhog Day, all I kept thinking was Megillat Esther, that we've been here before. We actually have been there before, whether it's, the golden age of Spain or whether it's the golden age of Babylonia. And I know this isn't just a hypothesis. Kadosh Baruch Hu had prophesied there are two ways. Yirmiyahu Hanavi, two ways. Whenever I speak to my students, they know this. I ask, okay, where do you see the future of the Jewish people? And they say, what do you mean? The future of the Jewish people is in Israel. Sometimes it's not just about where you want to raise your children. It's where do you want your grandchildren to be raised. So I said, okay, one of you is going to have to make that change. One of you is going to have to get up. And there are two ways of doing it. Either the Shabu Me'eretz Oyev, you're going to have to get up because you're not going to feel as comfortable as your own grandparents could tell you, or the Shavu Banim L'Gvulam, or we educate people from a very young age that this is where Am Yisrael is supposed to be, that this is where every single Jew can truly live up to the religious ideals. And that goes back to the very beginning, which incorporate the national identity. So it's hard to say that in Chutz La'aretz, you're not entirely religious unless you really are fulfilling all the mitzvot hatzluyot ba'aretz, the commandments that are dependent on being in the land. I think we do have to incorporate that. And if I can just encourage all the listeners then on a more optimistic, inspiring level. And you've heard this before from Reb Lichtenstein. You said, Rav Shechter says this all the time, that you can be a spectator on the side, or you can be an active member. So I'll be honest, David, that this war has made me feel just really even more badly than I did before. I commiserate really with those sentiments of maintaining the status quo. I feel badly for all those who are comfortable with mediocrity, albeit there are numerous challenges of living in the land of Israel, and I'm not dismissing that.
Sure.
But I feel bad for those who are missing out on participating in the next stages of the Jewish people and the redemption that we see.
This is a dynamic conversation of three people, so it has a natural flow. But I just want to go back for a second and say that I don't think American Jewry is boring, just to respond.
Okay, yes. I'm allowed to say that. I live in America.
Okay, I think there's a lot of things that come out of the American Jewish Orthodox scene that Israel gains a lot from too. One example most recently is Neo-Hasidus, which is a tremendous, fresh, exciting, impactful, inspiring development in a unique way. Again, this is not what this podcast is about, so I don't want to take it afield, but I do want to say that as someone who sees the culture, I don't think it's boring. I do think there's a lot of value there. I also think, and I want to say, and I think it's important, like we said before, that people knowing what it is. Israel and the Orthodox community here has a lot of issues. Unfortunately, the Orthodox community here, the Dati Leumi community, is not as retentive of their children as they are in America. It has a lot to do with the issues we're talking about. So, not taking anything away from the things said about the dream and the vision of where we need to be and etc. I just wanted to make clear for the record that I think there's a lot of value and inspiring things going on in America. And Israel's Orthodox community has a lot to learn and improve in general and to learn from America in particular, which doesn't take anything away from the fact that Israel should be more central in the minds of American Jews. I think it would make a very big difference, just for the record, for the protocol.
100%. I have it noted for the record. I fully agree with you that the American community is more retentive. I think that is actually by design and a part of my theory where the whole function of the American Orthodox community is to be retentive. That is literally like our whole design is retention, where in Israel, because you're building and the future is unknown, people explore and there's more confidence and comfort exploring. I'm not saying it's easy for parents when they see their children veer off, and I know you're talking about veering off in sometimes really, painful ways for parents. But yes, those are very different issues. I actually think that the retention issue highlights a lot of these differences. But I cannot thank you both enough for joining. As you were talking, I was thinking, you were talking so much about the mitzvos hatuluyos ba'aretz as a draw, and almost how foreign it is to hear, because in America, all we think about when it comes to mitzvos hatuluyos ba'aretz, the laws of the land, it's just the headache that it causes to buying produce from Israel and America. It's just a headache. We don't get to experience the opportunity of that beauty in that way. And if anything, the mitzvos hatuluyos ba'aretz in America is basically floor hockey and kosher restaurants. Those are our mitzvos hatuluyos ba'aretz, and we observe them meticulously. And there is a real question and some very exciting developments about what is next for the Dati community in Israel. And I hope that our listeners really examine where that future, that long-term future of their narrative arc, where that continues. I always end my interviews with more rapid-fire questions. And I was wondering if you could each humor me with rapid-fire questions. I'm curious about a book that inspired you or inspires your affiliation specifically with the Dati Leumi community. You already mentioned one by Rabbi Chaim Sabato. I'm curious if there are any other books that you would add to that reading list for those who want to be inspired about the values, ideas, stories specifically of the Dati Leumi community in Israel.
Without a question, the Tanakh.
The Tanakh. Don't stop reading after the death of Moshe. Stuff that happens after.
You said that these are fireable questions. That really is. If that's not the basis, then I don't know what is. I hope that everyone is proficient from the book of Genesis all the way through at the end of Chronicles, pays close attention to the very last word canonized in our Bible. Yes.
And if people
you have to look
want
it up
help
for homework,
learning how to translate that into modern days, I would suggest the writings of Rav Soloveitchik about Israel. Obviously, others wrote about Israel, like Rav Kook, but for an American audience, I think Rav Soloveitchik is the best voice, both in his official svarim, like the 5 drushot, or the new ones that are coming out. It's written from an American perspective, and I think it would be helpful for people.
I'll be honest, I regret not being exposed more to Rav Kook's writing at a younger age. I've become enamored by it. I don't think I would have understood anything that he's talking about had I been exposed earlier, but I've been drawn to it in incredible ways recently. My next question, if somebody gave you each a great deal of money money and allowed you to take a sabbatical for as long as you needed to go back to school and complete a PhD, what do you think the subject and title of your dissertation would be?
So I'm actually in the midst of doing that, but without the money. I will tell you, I'm writing on the misinterpreted messages of prophecy in the Bible.
The misinterpreted messages of prophecy in the Bible. That sounds fascinating.
Exploring Nevi'ei Sheker.
In the Torah, exploring Nevi'ei Sheker, false prophets.
Starting from the
in
Torah.
In the Torah, though.
And primarily in Nevi'im.
In Nevi'im, meaning you're not talking modern, Shabtai Tzvi, Frank. That's not what you're talking about.
No. In Tanakh itself. But obviously it has ramifications for other misinterpreted messages throughout Jewish history. Correct. The other is Sefer Vayikra, meaning I'm a little obsessed with Mikdash, and I think that it's time now to explore that much more, and many of my students know as well. It may not be number one on the list of priorities, but in the Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon style, I think that it's time to start preparing for the laws of purity, impurity, sacrifice. There's a lot that we need beforehand, but you asked if we had the time and the money, then I'd like to prepare the halachic handbook for preparing for Mikdash.
That is ambitious and moving, Rabbi Taragin.
So I'll give you a surprising answer. I would do exactly what I'm doing today because I find, at least for me, that I learn the best when it's things I teach people. And I would still continue working on things that people are interested in learning that can inspire them and help them grow and improve. And that's the area I like to focus on. And I think I learn best when I teach it, and I teach best when I learn it. So I would continue this.
I'm not going to lie to you. I love you, Rabbi Taragin. That was a total 100% cop-out answer. I say that with great love and admiration for you.
Thank you, Rabbi Shefkin. I agree with you. And yes, I would say that he does have a bucket list also of different topics that he'd like to explore. I don't know how much I can say over this podcast, but it definitely does dovetail with our conversation that one of my dreams was to help facilitate the Jewish community, literally the modern Orthodox community in the diaspora, to transition to a more religiously nationalist demographic here, and in doing so, literally bringing Yeshiva University to Israel. So that hopefully is starting this September. We already started
God willing.
We need it. Midrash here. Yes, hopefully the beginning.
Absolutely beautiful. Let's see more of that. My last question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules, especially yours. What time do you go to sleep at night? And what time do you wake up in the morning? Let's see what kind of diplomatic answer Rabbi Taragin
I'll answer that question for you. Shani and I are very different. Shani doesn't need sleep, at least not in an organized, official from X to Y. And it's only because I need real normal sleep that we go to sleep at normal times. But when I go to America, Shani stays up till 4 a.m. and etc. So we're different in that regard.
Yes. I always say he's a workaholic, but he needs his sleep. He needs about 7 hours.
6.5.
6.5.
6.5.
Earlier, I used to, for Shalom Bayit, to go to sleep somewhere between about 11:31.
Sometimes Shani goes to sleep and then gets up and goes back to work.
Then I get up and go back to work. Exactly.
I cannot thank you both enough. Rabbi and Rabbanit Taragin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rav David. It was really a pleasure, and hope we have more opportunities to edify, to educate, to build the future of Am Yisrael. Thank you.
Amen. That was an incredibly important conversation, and I hope in many ways that our listeners have the ears, and I hope that we said it in the right way, that it's able to resonate. I don't, God forbid, want this to be a adversarial America versus Israel, though it's hard to talk about it without sometimes seeing almost pedantic or too dismissive, God forbid, of the very, very real and important sacrifices and role that American Jewry plays in the building of Israel. Especially if you learn your history, we wouldn't have a thriving Israel without the very real support of Jews around the world. Yet at the same time, to really get in the weeds of the conversation, to really talk about the misunderstandings and the differences, particularly of the Dati Leumi community, to talk about it in very real terms, I think is important, though I hope it doesn't offend or doesn't upset. That's certainly not the intention. We're not trying to get into some major ideological debate, but really share the experience, the interiority of that community and that world. And if you'll allow me, I know this is, you can groan out loud as you're listening to this, but I have a new initiative that I began this year. It was kind of quiet because it began literally right after October 7th, and that is every week I've been sharing on the All Parsha app of the OU a weekly read of the Parsha through the lens of Jewish history. And you can look it up. It's called Reading Jewish History in the Parsha. And I also send out a Substack every week, which you can get on readingjewishhistoryin the Parsha.substack.com. I have all the links to the books and the articles that I quote. I'm not mentioning it now to get more signups, though that, of course, is always appreciated. I'm mentioning it now because of an idea that I mentioned related to our exploration of Parshas Va'era. We spoke about the question of when does redemption begin? Spoke about some of the early debates about religious Zionism and Messianic Zionism and the phrase Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, Atchalta de Geula, is Israel in fact the beginning of the flowerings of redemption, etc., etc. And at the very end, I quoted something from the Meshech Chochmah that I found extraordinarily powerful, and I think in some ways reflects a little bit, at least on my own struggle, on why Israel, for me, in my evolving relationship with Zionism and Israel itself, was something that felt a little bit out of reach. In the 6th chapter of Sefer Shmos in Parshas Va'era, in the 9th verse, the 9th pasuk, Perek Vav, pasuk Tes. This is right after the story of God telling Moshe the promises that he made to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and giving them the land of Israel. And it says, Vayedaber Moshe Kain el bnei Yisrael. Moshe relays this over to the Jewish people. V'lo shamu el Moshe. They could not listen to Moshe. Mikotza ruach ume avoda kasha. From their shortness, from their smallness of spirit, and from their very backbreaking work. How could it be that they didn't listen? They're enslaved. And Moshe comes with the word of God, with a promise of redemption. And the Meshech Chochmah, Rav Meir Simcha of Devinsk, says something extraordinarily powerful, where he writes, Vayedaber Moshe, of course I'll translate, V'lo shamu. They didn't listen to him. The Jewish people did not listen to Moshe. Perish Inyan Hava LaEretz Yisrael, talking specifically about the promise to bring them into Israel. Mikotza ruach u'me'avoda kasha, from their small spirit and their backbreaking work. Why? Ki derech koshi yom, because when you have the backbreaking work, the difficulties of every day, asher yachfotzu lishmoa rak kadei latzeis mitzarasam, the only thing you want to hear is how to get me out of my current present difficulty. How do you get me out of the back-breaking work? V'lo lishmoa behaftachos asidas ubehatzlachos neflos. They didn't have capacity to listen to these grand promises of the land of Israel and what we can build up. All they can think about is the stress and the pressure on their current backs right now as they speak. They didn't have the bandwidth and capacity to think about grand promises. And when I read that, I think about a lot of my own life and a lot about almost life itself, that life, the burdens of everyday life, of all the conversations that we have on 1840 in communities and shuls and synagogues around the world, tuition crisis, materialism, kids going off the derech, and all of these questions that come up. They're important questions. And to me, in some ways, these questions, the daily grind of work and getting back and trying to do Daf Yomi and trying to be there for your kids and trying to be there for your shul and for your kids' schools and making sure you have money left over to send my kids to camp, and all the questions that come up, in some ways, are the kotza ruach and avoda kasha. It's the difficulty, it's the daily grind of life itself. And I wonder sometimes if that daily grind of all of the very real and important problems that we have, that we need to deal with, that are before us in our lives. I know this. I have a 1-year-old, I have a 4-year-old, I have a 7-year-old. You have to tend to them. You want to make sure you're doing well in work. You have different goals. You have metrics. You want to hit them. You want to be there for your spouse, and all the difficulties that we have in our lives. And sometimes, I think ultimately for myself, it's hard, in the words of the Meshech Chochmah, lishmoa behaftachos asidos, to see a grand vision of what the future of the Jewish people can be, to really let your mind escape and say, maybe things could be different. Maybe the next generation can look wholly differently than what we've created here in America. And I don't know that I have the bandwidth to really think about that question. I'm struggling like everybody else. But there is a consolation that even when we don't have the bandwidth to really see that vision, even when the daily grind of life, and I know how real that is because it is my life, even when we, because of our own kotza ruach and avoda kasha, we don't have the capacity to vision in that way, there is still a comfort to, number one, see our story unfold in the Torah itself. And I think the greatest consolation is that even when we're unable to hear it, even when we're unable, v'lo shamu el Moshe, we're not able to see that vision, we're not able to imagine that future, the redemption still unfolds and we're still a part of it. And that even if we weren't able to listen to it at the right time, because of everything going on in our lives and how busy we are, and how hard it is to reimagine our lives and reimagine a different future several generations out, even if we can't listen, but still, God willing, each of us will one day hopefully be able to see with our own two eyes. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our dearest friend, Dina Emerson. Thank you so much, Dina, for your incredible work these past few months. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. And let me just say, I am so grateful for all of the listeners who reached out, sent in. We had a campaign at the end of December, still going on. It's never too late to donate. I know there's so many priorities for the Jewish community right now, and I feel guilty even inserting ourselves. But for all of those who listened and sent in, it was $18, especially the more substantial gifts that came in. It means the world to me, and quite literally, we don't get any other funding from anyone other than our listeners. Not a penny. Everything comes from our listeners, and really, this is what helps us continue doing the work that we're doing. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much to everyone who sent in, and if you're still listening after this extraordinarily long episode, you could still give now. And of course, you can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play in a future episode. That number is 516-519-3308. Again, that number is 516-519-3308. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18 followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.
Shomer Yisrael, Shemor She'eris Yisrael, V'yal Yovad Yisrael, Omrim Shema Shomer Yisrael, Shemor She'eris Yisrael, V'yal Yovad Yisrael. shine.